Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And before I get the required reminder, I'm going to be splitting my time with the member from North Okanagan, Shuswap. It's always an honor to bring the voices of Chad McKent-Leamington to this chamber, and today I look forward to speaking and addressing third reading of Bill C-34, an act to amend the Investment Act, Canada Act, with the aim of protecting Canada's national security, and that's the important part, Mr. Speaker. For 8 years of this Prime Minister, numerous foreign state-owned enterprises have acquired interest and control in many Canadian companies, intellectual property, intangible assets, and the data of our citizens. And as usual, this government has done too little, too late to fully protect our national economic and security interests. Now, Mr. Speaker, while Conservatives are pleased that 4 of our amendments were passed at committee, we are a bit bewildered as to why this Liberal NDP government would want to water this legislation down and defeated 10 amendments which would have made a more fully protected Canadian interest by having better legislation. Mr. Speaker, why? One of the amendments that was defeated at committee would have modified the definition of a state-owned enterprise to include any company or entity headquartered in an authoritarian state, and of course, one of the main ones there is China. The House of Commons' own Special Committee on the Canada-People's Republic of China relationship presented an interim report to this House last May. And it was entitled, "A Threat to Canadian Sovereignty, National Security Dimensions of the Canada-People's Republic of China relationship." This report offered an in-depth review of the national security implications related to the PRC's actions. It addressed key national security topics, including the safeguarding of Canadians from foreign interference, preventing threats to Canada's democratic institutions and elections, defending intellectual property and research, enhancing cybersecurity, combating organized crime and money laundering, a whole list of things here, Mr. Speaker, addressing global health governance threats, and scrutinizing the PRC's interests in the Arctic. This report, Mr. Speaker, should serve as a warning. We need to align ourselves with our allies. The U.S. has created the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS, which is an interagency committee authorized to review certain transactions involving foreign investment in the U.S. and certain real estate transactions by foreign persons to determine the effect of such transactions on the national security of the U.S. Have we not learned our lessons through COVID by allowing critical elements of our economy to be put under foreign control? In a recent CNBC article, CSIS officials quoted Casey Babb, an international fellow with the Glazer Centre for Israel-China Policy, and he's also an instructor here at Carleton University, here in Ottawa. And he said, China uses, obviously we know this, foreign investment as a strategic tool. I'm going to quote him. They use foreign investment as a door, as an entry point to gain access to markets, to gain access to government and to investors as well. He goes on to say, it's a great way to use illicit means to carry out illicit or even legal but injurious activities, end quote. Babb also said China is looking to tap into our natural resources, including oil, critical minerals, and fish. Mr. Speaker, this government's soft on China policy must end. One of the amendments that they refused to pass sought to list specific sectors necessary to preserve Canada's national security rather than using a systemic approach. And let me provide a personal example of a sector-specific area. On our own farm in Leamington, in the years prior to the Ukraine-Russian war, we've actually used more Belarusian potash, muriatic potash on the farm, than our own Canadian Saskatchewan potash. Why? Well, sea freight is relatively cheaper than rail freight. Why is our rail freight so expensive? Because it's being tied up hauling crude oil to eastern refineries rather than having that oil flow through an Energy East pipeline. And that's lowering our rail capacity for moving potash and other goods that cannot move by pipeline. Market supply and demand, Mr. Speaker, that drives up the cost of freight. In addition, 660,000 to 680,000 tons of nitrogen fertilizer, mainly urea, were imported pre-war into eastern and central Canada. Why is not Western natural gas flowing through a pipeline to fertilizer manufacturing plants here in eastern Canada? So again, Russia's invasion of Ukraine should teach us a lesson. Where we have critical inputs in Canada, we should ensure that we have the infrastructure that we can have those to be used domestically and competitively priced vis-a-vis foreign options. Another Conservative amendment that failed to pass would have exempted non-Canadian Five Eyes intelligent state-owned enterprises from this national security review process to prevent an overly broad review process. And this, unfortunately, sends all the wrong signals to our Five Eyes partners with whom this government's policies have been at odds. Canada needs to be seen as a reliable player in this partnership, and under the current government, this has not been the case. Canada needs to restore its trustworthy reputation with the UK, with the US, Australia, and New Zealand, so that critical intelligence information gathered by one member can be confidently shared with other members. And again, the failure of this amendment to pass sends all the wrong signals to our allies. Amendment 25.4, 1.1 would have allowed the Government of Canada to maintain ownership of intangible assets that have been developed in whole or in part by taxpayer funding. I'm going to give you an example. An intangible asset such as, and I learned this in preparation for this speech, radio frequency filtering systems for our Mounties. So what is that? That's a filter circuit that is made up of capacitors, inductors, and resistors that is used to filter signal frequency in communication channels. Well, what's behind this? Back to China, Mr. Speaker. In 2017, the China-based Hytera company acquired a telecom company from BC called Norsat. This company has significant Chinese government ownership, but guess what? It doesn't make any money. Doesn't that send a signal that this should be looked at? This company significantly lost money for 6 years. We rightfully called for a full national security review, but the industry minister refused and approved the Chinese acquisition that provided the RCMP with telecom equipment. Incredibly, the Federal Procurement Department awarded a $550,000 contract to Ontario-based Sinclair Technologies to build and maintain this radio frequency filtering system for the Mounties. And by the way, Sinclair Technologies is the parent company of Norsat International. In 2022, Norsat was charged with 21 counts of espionage in the U.S., and President Biden banned it from the U.S., but just 8 months later, the RCMP awarded China's Hytera subsidiary, Norsat, the contract to install telecom hardware in our RCMP comm systems. When questioned at committee, the RCMP was asked whether they knew whether Hytera was charged and banned from the U.S., and their answer was no. How can this government continue to let such enormous security breaches happen? Lithium. We all know how important that is for our economy. And as we know, EV is needed to make the batteries in our EV vehicles. 2019, the Liberals approved the sale of Canada's only lithium-producing mine to the China state-controlled Sinomine Resources. Every ounce of lithium mined in Canada right now goes to China, while Canadians are unable to supply lithium to our own growing EV auto industry, putting our nation in a potentially vulnerable situation. Again, in 2019, Conservatives demanded a full national security review. The soft on China, Liberals ignored it. I guess this would explain why the NDP Liberal coalition voted down Amendment 25.3, which would have allowed the minister to go back and review past state acquisitions through the national security review process. That would have allowed a more fulsome review. However, last week, the Prime Minister did show us that this government can go back as they adjusted the carbon tax on home heating fuel in Atlantic Canada and rural Canada. This government demonstrated they can reverse course after identifying mistake. Now that, of course, was in response to polling, not in the interest of national security. So, Mr. Speaker, it's time for a common sense government. A government that will allow our nation to prosper while at the same time protecting its citizens. Conservatives will continue to use our voice to ensure that both the prosperity and the protection of our citizens is defended. Thank you very much.